There was that upstart Brouet from the Rue Dauphine, who claimed to have the greatest line of pomades in Europe, or Caltot from the Rue Mauconseil, who had managed to become purveyor to the household of the Duchess d'Artois, or this totally unpredictable Antoine Pélissier from the Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, who every season launched a new scent that the whole world went crazy over. Perfumes like Pélissier's could make a shambles of the whole market. If the rage one year was Hungary water, and Baldini accordingly stocked up on lavender, bergamot, and rosemary to cover the demand, here came Pélissier with his air de musc, an ultra-heavy musk scent. Suddenly everyone had to reek like an animal, and Baldini had to rework his rosemary into hair oil and sew the lavender into sachets. If, however, he then bought adequate supplies of musk, civet, and castor for the next year, Pélissier would take a notion to create a perfume called Forest Blossom, which would be an immediate success. And when, after long nights of experiment or costly bribes, Baldini had finally found out the ingredients in Forest Blossom, Pélissier would trump him again with Turkish Nights, or Lisbon Spice, or Bouquet de la Cour, or some such damn thing. The man was indeed a danger to the whole trade with his reckless creativity. It made you wish for a return to the old rigid guild laws, made you wish for draconian measures against this nonconformist, against this inflationist of scent. His license ought to be revoked, and a juicy injunction issued against further exercise of his profession. And just on principle, the fellow ought to be taught a lesson, because this Pélissier wasn't even a trained perfumer and lover. His father had been nothing but a vinegar maker, and Pélissier was a vinegar maker too, nothing else. But as vinegar maker he was entitled to handle spirits, and only because of that had the skunk been able to crash the gates and wreak havoc in the preserve of the true perfumers. What did people need with a new perfume every season? Was that necessary? The public had been very content before with violet cologne and simple floral bouquets that you changed a smidgen every 10 years or so. For thousands of years people had made do with incense and myrrh, a few balms, oils, and dried aromatic herbs. And even once they had learned to use retorts and alembics for distilling herbs, flowers, and woods, and stealing the aromatic base of their vapours in the form of volatile oils, to crush seeds and pits and fruit rinds in oak presses, and to extract the scent from petals with carefully filtered oils, even then the number of perfumes had been modest. In those days a figure like Pélissier would have been an impossibility, for back then, just for the production of a simple pomade, you needed abilities of which this vinegar mixer could not even dream. You had to be able not merely to distill, but also to act as maker of salves, apothecary, alchemist, and craftsman, merchant, humanist, and gardener, all in one. You had to be able to distinguish sheep suet from calf suet, a Victoria violet from a Parma violet. You had to be fluent in Latin. You had to know when heliotrope is harvested, and when pelargonium blooms, and that the jasmine blossom loses its scent at sunrise. Obviously, Pélissier had not the vaguest notion of such matters. He had probably never left Paris, never in all his life seen jasmine in bloom. Not to mention having a wit of the Herculean elbow grease needed to wring a dollop of concrétion or a few drops of essence absolue from 100,000 jasmine blossoms. Probably he knew such things, knew jasmine, only as a bottle of dark brown liquid concentrate that stood in his locked cabinet alongside the many other bottles from which he mixed his fashionable perfumes. No, in the good old days of true craftsmen, a man like this coxcomb Pélissier would never have got his foot in the door. He lacked everything: character, education, serenity, and a sense for the hierarchy within a guild. He owed his few successes at perfumery solely to the discovery made some 200 years before by that genius Mauritius Frangipani, an Italian, let it be noted, that odors are soluble in rectified spirit. By mixing his aromatic powder with alcohol, and so transferring its odor to a volatile liquid, Frangipani had liberated scent from matter, had etherealized scent, had discovered scent as pure scent. In short, he had created perfume. What a feat! What an epoch-making achievement! Comparable, really, only to the greatest accomplishments of humankind, like the invention of writing by the Assyrians, Euclidean geometry, the ideas of Plato, or the metamorphosis of grapes into wine by the Greeks. A truly Promethean act. And yet, just as all great accomplishments of the spirit cast both shadow and light, offering humankind vexation and misery along with their benefits, so too Frangipani's marvellous invention had its unfortunate results. For now that people knew how to bind the essence of flowers and herbs, woods, resins, and animal secretions within tinctures and fill them into bottles, the art of perfumery was slipping bit by bit from the hands of the masters of the craft and becoming accessible to mountebanks, at least a mountebank with a possibly discerning nose, like this skunk Pelissier. Without ever bothering to learn how the marvellous contents of these bottles had come to be, they could simply follow their olfactory whims and concoct whatever popped into their heads or struck the public's momentary fancy. So much was certain. At the age of 35, this bastard Pelissier already possessed a larger fortune than he, Baldini, had finally accumulated after 3 generations of constant hard work. And Pelissier's grew daily, while his, Baldini's, daily shrank. That sort of thing would not have been even remotely possible before. That a reputable craftsman and established commerçant should have to struggle to exist, that had begun to happen only in the last few decades. And only since this hectic mania for novelty had broken out in every quarter, this desperate desire for action, this craze of experimentation, this rodomontado in commerce, in trade, and in the sciences. Or this insanity about speed. What was the need for all these new roads being dug up everywhere, and these new bridges? What purpose did they serve? What was the advantage of being in Lyon within a week? Who set any store by that? Whom did it profit? Or crossing the Atlantic, racing to America in a month, as if people hadn't got along without that continent for thousands of years. What had civilized man lost that he was looking for out there in jungles inhabited by Indians or Negroes? People even travelled to Lapland, up there in the north, with its eternal ice and savages who gorged themselves on raw fish. And now they hoped to discover yet another continent that was said to lie in the South Pacific, wherever that might be. And why all this insanity? Because the others were doing the same, the Spaniards, the damned English, the impertinent Dutch, whom you then had to go out and fight, which you couldn't in the least afford. One of those battleships cost a good 300,000 livres, and a single cannon shot would sink it in 5 minutes, for good and all, paid for with our taxes. The Minister of Finance had recently demanded 1/10 of all income, and that was simply ruinous, even if you didn't pay Monsieur his tithe. The very attitude was perverse. Man's misfortune stems from the fact that he does not want to stay in the room where he belongs. Pascal said that. And Pascal was a great man, a frangipani of the intellect, a real craftsman, so to speak, and no one wants one of those any more. People read incendiary books now by Huguenots or Englishmen, or they write tracts or so-called scientific masterpieces that put anything and everything in question. Nothing is supposed to be right anymore. Suddenly everything ought to be different. The latest is that little animals never before seen are swimming about in a glass of water. They say syphilis is a completely normal disease and no longer the punishment of God. God didn't make the world in 7 days, it's said, but over millions of years, if it was he at all. Savages are human beings like us. We raise our children wrongly, and the earth is no longer round like it was, but flat on the top and bottom like a melon, as if it made a damned bit of difference. In every field people question and bore and scrutinize and pry and dabble with experiments. It's no longer enough for a man to say that something is so or how it is so. Everything now has to be proven besides, preferably with witnesses and numbers and one or another of these ridiculous experiments. These Diderots and d'Alemberts and Voltaires and Rousseaus, or whatever names these scribblers have. There are even clerics among them and gentlemen of noble birth. They've finally managed to infect the whole society with their perfidious fidgets, with their sheer delight in discontent and their unwillingness to be satisfied with anything in this world. In short, with the boundless chaos that reigns inside their own heads. Wherever you looked, hectic excitement, people reading books, even women, priests dawdling in coffee-houses, and if the police intervened and stuck one of the chief scoundrels in prison, publishers howled and submitted petitions, ladies and gentlemen of the highest rank used their influence, and within a couple of weeks he was set free or allowed out of the country, from where he went right on with his unconscionable pamphleteering. In the salons, people chattered about nothing but the orbits of comets and expeditions, about leverage and Newton, about building canals, the circulation of the blood, and the diameter of the earth. The king himself had had them demonstrate some sort of newfangled nonsense, a kind of artificial thunderstorm they called electricity. With the whole court looking on, some fellow rubbed a bottle, and it gave off a spark, and His Majesty, so it was said, appeared deeply impressed. Unthinkable that his grandfather, the truly great Louis, under whose beneficent reign Baldini had been lucky enough to have lived for many years, would have allowed such a ridiculous demonstration in his presence. But that was the temper of the times, and it would all come to a bad end. When, without the least embarrassment, people could brazenly call into question the authority of God's church, when they could speak of the monarchy, equally a creature of God's grace, and the sacred person of the king himself, as if they were both simply interchangeable items in a catalogue of various forms of government to be selected on a whim, when they had the ultimate audacity, and have it they did, to describe God himself, the Almighty, the very God of very God, as dispensable, and to maintain in all earnestness that order, morals, and happiness on this earth could be conceived of without him, purely as matters of man's inherent morality and reason. God, good God! Then you needn't wonder that everything was turned upside down, that morals had degenerated, and that humankind had brought down upon itself the judgment of him whom it denied. It would come to a bad end. The great comet of 1681. They had mocked it, calling it a mere clump of stars, while in truth it was an omen sent by God in warning, for it had portended, as was clear by now, a century of decline and disintegration, ending in the spiritual, political, and religious quagmire that man had created for himself, into which he would one day sink, and where only glossy, stinking swamp flowers flourished, like Pélissier himself. Baldini stood at the window, an old man, and gazed malevolently at the sun angled above the river. Barges emerged beneath him and slid slowly to the west, towards the Pont Neuf and the quay below the galleries of the Louvre. No one poled barges against the current here, for that they used the channel on the other side of the island. Here everything flowed away from you, the empty and the heavily laden ships, the rowboats and the flat-bottomed punts of the fishermen, the dirty brown and the golden-curled water. Everything flowed away, slowly, broadly, and inevitably. And if Baldini looked directly below him, straight down the wall, it seemed to him as if the flowing water were sucking the foundations of the bridge with it, and he grew dizzy. He had made a mistake buying a house on the bridge, and a second when he selected one on the western side, because constantly before his eyes now was a river flowing from him, and it was as if himself and his house and the wealth he had accumulated over many decades were flowing away like the river, while he was too old and too weak to oppose the powerful current. Sometimes, when he had business on the left bank, in the quarter of the Sorbonne or around Saint-Sulpice, he would not walk across the island and the Pont Saint-Michel, but would take the longer way across the Pont Neuf, for it was a bridge without buildings, and then he would stand at the eastern parapet and gaze up the river, just for once to see everything flowing towards him. And for a few moments he basked in the notion that his life had been turned around, that his business was prospering, his family thriving, that women threw themselves at him, that his own life, instead of dwindling away, was growing and growing. But then, if he lifted his gaze the least bit, he could see his own house, tall and spindly and fragile, several hundred yards away on the Pont au Change, and he saw the window of his study on the second floor, and saw himself standing there at the window, saw himself looking out at the river and watching the water flow away, just as now. And then the beautiful dream would vanish, and Baldini would turn away from where he stood on the Pont Neuf, more despondent than before, as despondent as he was now, turning away from the window and taking his seat at his desk. Before him stood the flacon with Pélissier's perfume. Glistening golden brown in the sunlight, the liquid was clear, not clouded in the least. It looked totally innocent, like a light tea, and yet contained, in addition to 4/5 alcohol, 1/5 of a mysterious mixture that could set a whole city trembling with excitement. The mixture, moreover, might consist of 3 or 30 different ingredients, prepared from among countless possibilities in very precise proportions to one another. It was the soul of the perfume, if one could speak of a perfume made by this ice-cold profiteer Pélissier as having a soul, and the task now was to discover its composition. Baldini blew his nose carefully and pulled down the blind at the window, since direct sunlight was harmful to every artificial scent or refined concentration of odors. He pulled a fresh white lace handkerchief out of a desk drawer and unfolded it. Then, holding his head far back and pinching his nostrils together, he opened the flacon with a gentle turn of the stopper. He did not want, for God's sake, to get a premature olfactory sensation directly from the bottle. Perfume must be smelled in its efflorescent, gaseous state, never as a concentrate. He sprinkled a few drops onto the handkerchief, waved it in the air to drive off the alcohol, and then held it to his nose. In 3 short, jerky tugs, he snatched up the scent as if it were a powder, immediately blew it out again, fanned himself, took another sniff in waltz time, and finally drew one long, deep breath, which he then exhaled slowly with several pauses, as if letting it slide down a long, gently sloping staircase. He tossed the handkerchief onto his desk and fell back into his armchair. The perfume was disgustingly good. That miserable Pélissier was, unfortunately, a virtuoso, a master to heaven's shame, even if he had never learned one thing 1,000 times over. Baldini wished he had created it himself, this Amor and Psyche. There was nothing common about it, an absolute classic, full and harmonious, and for all that fascinatingly new. It was fresh, but not frenetic. It was floral, without being unctuous. It possessed depth, a splendid, abiding, voluptuous, rich, brown depth, and yet was not in the least excessive or bombastic. Baldini stood up almost in reverence and held the handkerchief under his nose once again. "Wonderful, wonderful," he murmured, sniffing greedily. "It has a cheerful character. It's charming, it's like a melody, puts you in a good mood at once. What nonsense, a good mood!" And he flung the handkerchief back onto his desk in anger, turned away and walked to the farthest corner of the room, as if ashamed of his enthusiasm. Ridiculous, letting himself be swept up in such eulogies. Like a melody, cheerful, wonderful, good mood. How idiotic, childishly idiotic. A moment's impression, an old weakness, a matter of temperament, most likely his Italian blood. Judge not as long as you're smelling. That is rule number 1, Baldini, you muttonhead. Smell when you're smelling, and judge after you have smelled. Amor and Psyche is not half bad as a perfume. A thoroughly successful product, a cleverly managed bit of concocting, if not to say conjuring. And you could expect nothing but conjuring from a man like Pélissier. Of course, a fellow like Pélissier would not manufacture some hackneyed perfume. The scoundrel conjured with complete mastery of his art, confusing your sense of smell with its perfect harmony. In the classical arts of scent, the man was a wolf in sheep's clothing. In short, he was a monster with talent, and what was worse, a perverter of the true faith. But you, Baldini, are not going to be fooled. You were surprised for a moment by your first impression of this concoction. But do you know how it will smell an hour from now when its volatile ingredients have fled and the central structure emerges? Or how it will smell this evening when all that is perceptible are the heavy, dark components that now lie in odorous twilight beneath a veil of flowers? Wait and see, Baldini. The second rule is, perfume lives in time. It has its youth, its maturity, and its old age. And only if it gives off a scent equally pleasant at all 3 different stages of its life can it be called successful. How often have we not discovered that a mixture that smelled delightfully fresh when first tested, after a brief interval was more like rotten fruit, and finally reeked of nothing but the pure civet we had used too much of. Utmost caution with the civet. 1 drop too much brings catastrophe, an old source of error. Who knows? Perhaps Pélissier got carried away with the civet. Perhaps by this evening all that's left of his ambitious amour and psyche will be just a whiff of cat's piss. We shall see. We shall smell it. Just as a sharp axe can split a log into tiny splinters, our nose will fragment every detail of this perfume. And then it will be only too apparent that this ostensibly magical scent was created by the most ordinary, familiar methods. We, Baldini, perfumer, shall catch Pélissier, the vinegar man, at his tricks. We shall rip the mask from his ugly face and show the innovator just what the old craft is capable of. We'll scrupulously imitate his mixture, his fashionable perfume. It will be born anew in our hands, so perfectly copied that the humbug himself won't be able to tell it from his own. No, that's not enough. We shall improve it. We'll show up his mistakes and rinse them away, and then rub his nose in it. You're a bungler, Pélissier. An old stinker is what you are, an upstart in the craft of perfumery, and nothing more. And now to work, Baldini. Sharpen your nose and smell without sentimentality. Dissect the scent by the rules of the art. You must have the formula by this evening. And he made a dive for his desk, grabbing paper, ink, and a fresh handkerchief, laid it all out properly, and began his analysis. The procedure was this: to dip the handkerchief in perfume, pass it rapidly under his nose, and extract from the fleeting cloud of scent one or another of its ingredients, without being significantly distracted by the complex blending of its other parts. Then, holding the handkerchief at the end of his outstretched arm, to jot down the name of the ingredient he had discovered, and repeat the process at once, letting the handkerchief flit by his nose, snatching at the next fragment of scent, and so on.